Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Matt Williams. I'm a tutor in politics and what is known as the Access Fellow here at Jesus College at the University of Oxford. Now, what are you thinking? Now, what I'm aiming to do in today's video is to talk about independent-mindedness, because we are looking at Oxford for people who think for themselves. So I'm very often asked, what should I read, what should I watch, what should I listen to in order to get into Oxford? And the subtext to those questions is often, what should I think? What are the correct thoughts for me to have to be a good applicant to your university? And it's a really difficult question because the honest answer is, I want you to think for yourself. I want you to develop the capacity to come up with your own ideas, your own opinions, your own views on whatever you're interested in. And indeed, I want you to develop your interests. So this is building on a video I posted last week about supercurricular activities and why they're so important for a competitive application to Oxford. So go and check that out if you haven't already. And today we're going to talk about how you can build on those supercurricular activities and really tell us what you think. And this is so powerful, especially in an Oxford interview, where being able to demonstrate your independence of mind becomes very important indeed. Okay, so let's dive in and start with where you should start in hunting for your interests. So the metaphor I'm going to use here is that you should try and hunt the white rabbit from Alice in Wonderland, which is a great book that was written here in Oxford by an Oxford maths professor. And what I mean by this is that you should chase dopamine. So the first and most common question I receive tends to be, what should I read? Or what should I watch? Or what sort of puzzle should I do in order to be a strong applicant to Oxford? And the answer is you should do stuff that you care about, that you find interesting. Obviously, we want to see that it's at the right sort of level, that it's demonstrating your ability to be an undergraduate student at Oxford, but that still leaves open a huge variety of different interests you could pursue. And I would like to see, as an admissions tutor, that you have some interests of your own. It's quite reassuring to see that someone is able to come up with some of their own thoughts and pursue their own passions, rather than constantly having to take cues from other people who are telling them what they ought to be interested in. So how should you do that? Well, you will have probably noticed on occasions in the past when you found out a fact or a new idea that it gave you a slight thrill. Now that thrill is most likely dopamine. It's a neurotransmitter that gives us that sort of pleasurable feeling when we've been hunting for something for a long time and we finally get it, what we want. Okay, and you get it in all sorts of contexts in your life, but you can get it for academic things. And what you should do is to just keep hunting that. Basically, you should be having a whale of a time. When you are reading around your subject and doing those supercurricular activities, you should be having as much fun as possible. Okay, but to make this all really concrete, I'll give you an example. So I basically hunted the white rabbit for chemistry. Chemistry is a subject I have almost no knowledge of. I haven't studied it since I was, for a long time, let's put it that way. And so I thought, right, well, I will try and hunt the white rabbit for chemistry. I will chase that dopamine thrill, that rush. And so what I did is I started with Wikipedia, which is perfectly fine as a sort of starting point. Obviously, that's not likely to be the best quality to demonstrate your skills in the end, but to start with it's great. So I started with Wikipedia's entry on chemistry. I'm going to have to wear my tinted glasses because I'm half blind, so just bear with me. And I found it quite interesting, but a little bit complicated because I don't have much training in chemistry. But one thing that jumped out at me was the concept of chirality. So this was me sort of going, ooh, that's a bit thrilling. That's giving me a bit of a dopamine hit. That's interesting. So chirality, as you'll probably know better than me, is to do with the asymmetry of certain molecules. So certain molecules have exactly the same components, the same compounds within them, same ingredients, if you like, but they are mirror images of each other. And the reason that this really grabbed my attention is because this is apparently essential to life. So this sort of really fundamental quirk of chemistry or biochemistry was completely unknown to me and turns out to be basically why I'm here and able to talk to you right now. So it's kind of important. And so having developed that interest, I thought I'd chase it to the sort of level that would be of interest to an Oxford admissions tutor. And that basically means reading the sort of stuff that undergraduate students read. Basically, you're pretending to be an undergraduate student. That makes you credible. If you show that you've pretended to be an undergraduate student, then you've demonstrated that you're ready to start studying with us, is the rule of thumb for supercurricular activities. And so I searched on Google Scholar for articles to do with chirality, and one on chirality in life, admittedly quite old now, but nonetheless cited many times, came up, and it was freely available, and so I read it, and it blew my little mind. It was amazing, really, really fascinating. I didn't understand all of it, and you wouldn't be expected to understand everything that you read in this sort of academic paper. It's technical, it's tricky, but nonetheless, I took away enough from it to be able to say credibly that I have some supercurricular experiences in chemistry, and crucially they are based on things that I'm passionate about. Now, I was able to achieve that with no formal training in chemistry within about 2 hours. So it's really not that much of an imposition on someone to develop their own passions. But I know what tends to put people off, what tends to hold them back from pursuing their passions, is that they don't feel they're allowed to. They don't give themselves the license to look into stuff they care about. They're convinced that we in universities like Oxford want them to look into specific things that we care about. But I, hand on heart, would tell you, no, we want you to develop your passions, provided that they are able, they will help you demonstrate that you're ready to be an undergraduate student, so they're of the right quality. Those passions can be in all sorts of things, okay? So what should you do then? Well, once you've looked into something like chirality or anything else that you find of interest in your chosen discipline, you need to start thinking about it for yourself. So don't just consume whatever somebody else has said. Don't sort of read a paper and say, right, that's it. Those are my opinions now. You've got to think for yourself. Because what do you think are the four most commonly uttered words in a university, I'm sure, certainly in Oxford, okay? I'm not just interested in how well you can faithfully recall stuff that I've taught you or stuff that you've read in a book. I'm interested in how you can push us forward. You can help contribute to our understanding of the universe. Okay, so you've got to get used to thinking for yourself. Now, a common technique that I use to gauge people's ability to think for themselves is the American flag test. And if you've seen a few of my videos, you might be familiar with this, so you might want to skip ahead. But basically, I ask people to say what they can see in this image. And what they tend to say is that they can see 50 stars. And that's fine, there are 50 stars, but I can't believe that they've actually counted 50 stars in the amount of time I've given them. So what's really happened there is that someone's told them that the American flag has 50 stars. And so whenever someone says, think about the American flag, that factoid sort of bursts its way out of their brains and they go, it's got 50 stars. And whilst that's correct, it's not independent-minded. You're kind of the mouthpiece for someone else's views on the American flag. But I asked you what you saw in the flag, okay? And the way to make sure that it is your voice that's coming across, it's your thoughts, is to behave much more like a child, like a 5-year-old who's never seen this image before and will be full of questions. So then you might come up with something like, well, why are there stars? Why 50 stars to represent the states of America? Why not 50 bananas or 50 donuts or anything else, right? And why stripes? Well, you may be aware that the stripes represent the 13 original colonies of the USA, but why represent those with stripes? Why not represent them with puffins or, I don't know, loyalty cards? Obviously I'm being a little bit facetious, but we've got to be able to understand what's going on here. And actually, when you ask those sorts of questions, you come up with much more interesting insights. Because one theory as to why there are stripes on the American flag is that it represents a prison uniform, and that it was the revolutionaries in America saying that we are prisoners of the British Empire. So that's an interesting fact that people are less likely to know than that it's got 50 stars. And the reason they're less likely to know is that they're less likely to ask. Okay, if you stop assuming you have lots of knowledge and you kind of assume actually you don't have much knowledge and you ask questions like a child would, you keep your mind really nice and open. And this links to a great philosophical principle, which is that we should be much more intellectually humble. Now, a famous Greek philosopher called Plato took this to quite an extreme level. He said we're all trapped in a cave of complete ignorance. We can't see the real world. I mean, we think we can, but our brains are just far too feeble to be able to comprehend the complexity of reality. Now, whilst I possibly wouldn't take it as far as Plato has, there's a lot to that, and that one of the crucial things to thinking for yourself is accepting how much doubt there is around the world. I mean, take something like, what is gravity? You may be able to tell me, well, gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared, as a measure of its impact on Earth. But what is gravity? Why does gravity exist? How do we know where gravity is and how it's working on us? Those are the sorts of questions that a 5-6-year-old might come up with, because they're not assuming they know stuff, and they're not assuming that what the listener wants to hear is an accurate answer to a textbook question. They're going to think more conceptually, more open-mindedly, and they're going to be quite happy with not knowing everything. And actually, of course, you'll be aware that people are expending extraordinary amounts of money and effort to try and find gravitational waves, and there's a lot of doubt and uncertainty about what gravity is at that level. So in order to keep an open mind, accept how little we know is really healthy. But of course, at some point, you've got to come up with some opinions. It's all very well to say, I don't know, everything's doubtful, and just sort of bury yourself in Plato's cave. But at some point, you need to contribute something. You need to help us solve these uncertainties, at least for now, right? We know enough about gravity such that planes don't just drop out of the sky. So at some point, we've just sort of parked Plato's doubt and said, do you know what, we've got enough to go on. Okay, so you've got to do a bit of that as well. So whilst you want to keep an open mind and accept a bit of uncertainty, at some point you've got to move from that to conclusion. And one thing to keep into your considerations are that we often concern ourselves solely with theory, solely with the stories that we're telling about the world. But there are so many other layers to an academic puzzle. There's the concepts, so those are sort of the language we use to describe the field, like gravity. And there's methods, like how you would measure gravity. And then there's data sets, what measures and what sort of particular metrics do you use, right? And on all of those, you can start to try and work out, well, what makes sense? What is the most plausible answer for you, okay? And what makes sense to you? So, for example, let's say we were trying to work out a good question that a 5-year-old might ask, perhaps not, as to why Hamlet is supposedly better than Coriolanus. So these two Shakespeare plays, Coriolanus is very rarely staged and is not considered as good as Hamlet, but why? Well, there we could come up with some theory about the sort of the overall sense of what Hamlet achieves in terms of it teaching us stuff about death and self-doubt and self-loathing and things like that. But we can go deeper by thinking about things like concepts. What is death and how is it explored? And what is family and how is that explored in those two plays? And then we can think about method. Could we measure? Could we actually sort of come up with some sort of quantification to say that Coriolanus is X% less good than Hamlet? Do you see what I mean? Think about the different levels and try and come up with ideas that make sense on all of those levels, and that will make you a much more wide-ranging, deep thinker than most people are capable of. And it's not that they're not capable of doing it because they don't have the capacity at all. It's just that they don't practice it. This is nothing to do with being born a genius. This is just about practice. Okay, so moving on. You need to also think about where's your head at. Now, this is another bit of philosophy. Our mind is extendable because, of course, we make notes, right? And so a lot of my thoughts are on my phone, and so that phone is therefore a literal extension of my mind, right? It's effectively part of my brain, and that's common for all of us. So you've got to think about how you take notes and how you record things as you're reading and as you're thinking about stuff. And at all stages, you need to make sure that you're recalling your thoughts and you're practicing those thoughts. So don't just sort of passively take notes about stuff you've read. Analyze them. This is important because this matters to me because. I've got an image here of Einstein's brain because Einstein grew brain cells by using his brain. And the bit shaded in red is called the omega fold, which he grew by playing the violin an awful lot. And the point I'm trying to make here is that through practice, through diligence, you'll grow capacity. So don't think of this as what I'm suggesting here of thinking for yourself as an exercise that only geniuses can do, well, geniuses are made, they're not born. So go out and make yourself a genius if that's what you want to be, okay? Also think about what your brain needs in order to function, in order to think independently, which is basically a lot of nourishment, a lot of care. The brain is a sensitive organ, as all of our internal organs are. It's only 3% or so of your body mass, but it consumes between a fifth and a quarter of your daily calories. It can allegedly run on 1 blueberry muffin's worth of calories per day, but it needs vitamins, it needs plenty of water, and it needs plenty of sleep. So make sure you're looking after yourself, because this sort of independent mindedness will become just horrifyingly difficult if you're not caring for yourself. Okay? Another thing to do is to listen. So it is important to listen to what other people are saying, but do so actively rather than passively. Don't just consume what someone else says and suddenly make it that your opinion on things. We want to know what you think. Remember, what do you think are the 4 most common words you will hear at university. So get used to, give yourself a bit of an ear training exercise. Listen out for things that you would want to ask more questions about. Remember, imagine you're sort of 5 years old and you're going to be full of questions. You know, you're not going to let things slide. If someone says, oh, this is the way the world is, you're going to come back with, why? What do you mean? Right? So listen in particular for anything that they say that might be ambiguous, and that will commonly be in anything that's couched in adjectives or adverbs, or anything that's conceptually broad. So a few examples I've got here are things like hardness for material science, the number E in mathematics, a concept like justice or beauty or agape. You know, if I was talking to my 6-year-old son and I was saying something about, oh, isn't this flower beautiful? He would come back and say, what do you mean by beautiful? And that's exactly the sort of childlike thinking that we should all be practicing, because it makes you just capable of noticing more stuff, and it makes you a much more independent thinker, okay? So have a think about that. Speak as well, all right? So once you've listened to stuff, once you've read stuff, once you've done some puzzles, you've done some thinking, get used to sharing your thoughts out loud with other people, ideally with people who aren't expert in the field, because you want to get to a point of clarity without just sounding clever. It's relatively easy if you are just copying what someone else has said to sound clever. If you use lots of long, complicated technical words, you can basically sort of bamboozle your audience, and they start thinking, wow, he's clever or she's clever, but I don't have a clue what they've just said. So what you want to do is to get used to saying what you think is interesting or important in this field in words of 1 or 2 syllables. So I tried to explain chirality and life to my wife, to just try and sort of see if I could explain it. I didn't do a terribly good job, so I went back and had a look again at the paper. So that's what I'm talking about. You just get used to sharing your thoughts with somebody else, and you'll become better at it. And they will hopefully challenge you on some of those things, but you don't need to take those as a personal challenge. That's just an intellectual challenge to help shore up what you're saying. Even if you just practice in front of the mirror, or with your pet, or whatever, just getting used to talking out loud and seeing if what you're saying is clear to you and to someone else, that's really helpful. Okay, and then one sort of final point I'd make is try and become a bit of an expert about something. If you want to demonstrate that you're independent-minded, then showing that you have a bit of expertise, a bit of knowledge on a subject you're passionate about is really powerful. And also, it's just fun. It's more fun for you, right? If you have something quite specific that you're really interested in, then that's great. Try and find a bit of an angle. If we want to find a candidate who's really credible in an interview or on a personal statement for Oxford, if they've got a bit of expertise, that is a lot more credible than someone who says they've got a general interest in chemistry, in law, in medicine, or what have you, okay? And expertise or originality, I would say, is roughly speaking a function of knowledge plus detail plus curiosity. So knowing a bit about the field is obviously important for expertise, but having a bit of an attention to detail, like a 5-year-old would, helps you pick out the questions you would like to answer. So, my inner 5-year-old looked at the American flag and said, but why stars? And I went and looked into it, and I thought, well, the Chinese flag has stars as well, and they look exactly the same, and so does the Angolan flag and the Pakistani flag. So why do all these flags have stars on them? It turns out that that star shape with 5 points is the Egyptian hieroglyphic for star. Now, I suspect most of the peoples of these countries don't realize they've got an Egyptian hieroglyphic on their flags, but that's the sort of way you can get an angle. You can think for yourself because you ask the right questions and you follow your interests. You hunt the white rabbits, okay? And so use curiosity as well as attention to detail, and you will find a bit of an angle. So my angle, this is my book that was published last year, is language in law, and I write computer programs to machine read laws and to explain any patterns that can be discerned from the laws that politicians write. So that's the thing that I've always been interested in. It's not because someone told me to be interested in it, it's because I pursued it and I thought it would be valuable beyond my own interest. And that's what we're looking for, okay? So have a think about what you're thinking. Don't feel too worried about thinking the right things or reading the right things or doing the right things. Provided that it's at the right sort of level, you can look into pretty much anything and tell us your thoughts on it, and that would actually be a lot more valuable than someone who is passive and who's a recipient and who's not someone who's looking to show their passion and demonstrate their interest, because that person is much more credible as an undergraduate, because as an undergraduate you have to develop your passions and you have to look into stuff on your own a lot of the time. So I hope that makes sense. If you've got any questions at all, let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Thanks so much. Bye now.